Hello detectives, welcome back to Criminal Minds True Stories, where today we delve into a case as chilling as it is heartbreaking. In this story, we explore the Araceli case, a child lost, a nation distrustful. Prepare yourself, find a quiet place, and put on your headphones, because what you're about to hear will leave you questioning everything you think you know. Step into the shadows with me as we unravel this dark and unsettling mystery. I remember the day Araceli disappeared like it was yesterday. May 18th, 1973 should have been just another day. She was 8, a little girl with a smile so wide that it felt like she could brighten even the cloudiest skies in Vitória. I'd seen her around Sarah, skipping down the street with her school bag swinging, her pigtails bouncing. Kids like her were everywhere back then, carefree, safe enough to walk home from school without a second thought. That's what everyone thought anyway, until Araceli didn't make it home that afternoon. Her family thought she'd be back for dinner, but that night she wasn't sitting at the table, and the silence that took her place, that's something I don't think her parents have ever shaken. It was a haunting feeling that settled over the whole town when news broke of her disappearance. The next morning, there were posters, frantic phone calls, and people searching, checking every alley, every abandoned lot. Parents held their kids a little tighter. People started double-checking their locks. The police initially treated it as a simple case of a lost child. Kids wander, right? But this didn't feel like just a case of a kid getting lost. There were whispers around town, folks mentioning they saw her near a bar in Vitória, but nothing concrete. It was just like she vanished into thin air. And as the days passed, that unease in the air only grew darker. 6 days later, when they finally found her, the whole city felt like it collectively stopped breathing. I remember hearing the news, and it felt like a punch to the gut. Araceli wasn't just missing anymore, she'd been found, but in the most horrific state imaginable. Her small body had been left in a way that robbed her of any resemblance to that bright, happy child. Advanced decomposition, they said. But it wasn't just the natural process that had done this to her. There were signs of unimaginable violence, things no one wanted to picture but couldn't help but think about. The shockwave hit hard. This wasn't just a lost child anymore. This was something darker, something that shattered any sense of safety people held on to. As the investigation began, it didn't take long before whispers turned into louder suspicions. People started talking about the kinds of families she might have crossed paths with, the ones with money, power, the kind of people you don't just accuse without consequence. There was talk that some very influential names were mixed up in this, people who could bend things to their will. The police seemed hesitant, like they were walking on eggshells. It was subtle at first, but it became obvious that something wasn't right. Evidence went missing, leads fell through, and every time we thought we were getting closer to the truth, it was like the case hit another wall. It's hard to describe the anger that started bubbling up in the community. This wasn't just about Araceli anymore, it was about what her death represented. People were scared, yes, but there was also this growing resentment. We all saw how quickly things could be brushed under the rug when certain names were involved. I mean, how does evidence just disappear? How do leads go cold that fast? There were even rumors of witnesses being paid off or intimidated into silence. The kind of fear that gripped Vitória wasn't just fear of the person who did this to Araceli, it was fear of the whole system failing us. If someone could get away with this, what did that mean for the rest of us? Then there was the trial, years later, in 1980. 3 men were finally brought in as suspects. By that time, everyone had been holding their breath, waiting for justice that felt like it was always slipping further out of reach. At first, there was relief. It felt like, maybe after all the whispers, the silence, and the frustration, something would finally happen. But even that turned out to be false hope. Those men were convicted, yes, but not for long. They appealed, and just like that, they were acquitted. Insufficient evidence, they said. I remember the disgust and disbelief in people's eyes, the way people shook their heads. as if they'd always known it would end like this. After that, the case was quietly archived, almost like it was just another unsolved mystery in the files, another cold case with no justice. But for the rest of us, Araceli's memory didn't just fade away. People talked about her like she was still around, like her spirit had lingered, demanding answers we knew would never come. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, the pain seemed to resurface, raw and unresolved. It was like an open wound that Vitória, maybe all of Brazil, just couldn't heal from. People would gather, share memories, light candles, hoping that somehow, maybe just by remembering her, it would keep her from being completely forgotten in the shadows of corruption and silence. But then, something strange happened. In 2000, the government established May 18th as the National Day to combat abuse and sexual exploitation of children and adolescents. In Araceli's memory, for a lot of us, it felt like a bittersweet victory. I mean, finally, her name was cemented in history, a reminder of the horrors she endured and the injustice that followed. But it also felt like a reminder that nothing was ever resolved. Her killers walked free, and here we were, decades later, still haunted by a little girl's lost smile and the questions no one dared to answer. It's hard to say if that day actually brings peace, but it keeps the wound open, keeps people talking. You can still feel the unease when people talk about her, especially the older folks who remember every detail, every headline, every rumor. It's like a ghost story that lingers, but not the kind that fades over time. No, Araceli's story is the kind that sticks, that makes you look over your shoulder, that makes parents grab their kids' hands a little tighter. I've seen families over the years grow wary of letting their kids walk to school alone, even in broad daylight, and who can blame them? The horror of what happened to her reminds us all how quickly innocence can be taken, how vulnerable children are in a world where people with power can manipulate the truth, hide evidence, and silence witnesses. Sometimes I wonder if the people involved in covering it up ever feel remorse, if they ever think about her, or about the damage they've done, not just to Araceli, but to everyone who looked up to the law for protection. We're left with this hollow, bitter feeling, knowing that justice wasn't served. It's like a slap in the face every time her name comes up, knowing that those responsible are probably out there living their lives, while her family and community are left with nothing but a memorial day and a reminder of how twisted things can get when power overrides justice. I think what scares me the most, even now, is how easy it was for her case to go cold. 1 minute, the entire country was fixated on finding her killer, and the next, it was like everyone was told to just forget. It was a different time, sure, but even then, you could feel this strange shift. People stopped asking questions, the media went quiet, and it felt like we were all just expected to move on. For Araceli's family, though, moving on wasn't an option. They had to live every day knowing the system didn't just fail them, it betrayed them. It's a kind of betrayal that sticks, that infects every part of life, makes you doubt everyone, everything. I've heard people say, well, it was so long ago. Why does it still matter? But I don't think people get it. It's not just about Araceli's death. It's about what her case represents. It's a symbol of everything wrong with our system, of how easily people in power can manipulate the truth and walk away unscathed. When you grow up in a place where everyone knows about this case, where people still whisper about it, it becomes more than just a memory. It's a warning. You start to see the world differently through this lens of suspicion and fear, and you realize that if something like this could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. For a lot of us, the image of Araceli haunts us, not just because of what happened, but because of what could have been if justice had actually been served. I mean, think about it. An 8-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her, a future stolen in the most brutal way, and yet the people responsible got to walk free. It's like the worst kind of nightmare, one where you wake up and realize it wasn't a dream, it's real, and it's permanent. Every year when May 18th comes around, we're forced to confront it all over again. You see her face in photos, young, smiling, oblivious to the horrors that lay ahead. It's heartbreaking, really, to think that her life was reduced to a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily a child's innocence can be shattered. Sometimes I wonder if Araceli knew something was wrong in those last moments, if she felt that fear creeping in. Did she cry out for help? Did she hope someone would come to save her? It's those questions that keep you up at night, that make you wonder how a place so close to home could hold so much darkness. People don't like to talk about it anymore. Maybe it's too painful, or maybe they've just given up on ever finding out the truth. But for those of us who remember, who lived through those days of fear and anger, it's impossible to forget. Every time I walk past where they found her, there's this heaviness that settles in. It's like the place is marked, like the ground itself remembers what happened. People have moved on, buildings have changed, but there's this eerie silence that clings to that area, a chill that sinks into your bones if you stand there long enough. It's a reminder that the past doesn't just disappear because people stop talking about it. I've seen people avoid that spot altogether, and I can't blame them. There's something unnatural about it, as if the horror of what happened to Araceli left a scar on that place, a wound that never fully healed. The saddest part is knowing that there are still people who hold pieces of the truth, people who know exactly what happened, but choose to stay silent. Whether it's out of fear, loyalty, or something else, that silence speaks louder than any confession ever could. In a way, it's worse than the crime itself, knowing that there's a cover-up, that people with power and influence can keep the truth buried for decades. It makes you question everything. It makes you wonder what else has been hidden, what other stories have been silenced, all because someone decided they were too important to face the consequences. I've tried to put it out of my mind, but every time I hear about another missing child, my thoughts go right back to Araceli. It's a cycle that never really ends, and I know I'm not the only one who feels that way. For so many of us, her case left a lasting scar, a sense that justice can be twisted and controlled, that some lives seem to matter less than others when they clash with those in power. You grow up hearing that the law is there to protect you, but when something like this happens, it shatters that belief. You start to wonder if the law is just another tool for the powerful to wield as they see fit. It's a hard pill to swallow, realizing that the world isn't as fair or as just as you once thought. And the anger, it never really fades. It's this quiet rage, buried deep, but always simmering, ready to come to the surface whenever you're reminded of what was lost. I think that's why people still gather, why they still light candles and say prayers for Araceli. It's not just about honoring her memory, it's about holding on to a hope, however slim, that someday the truth will come out, that maybe one day someone will finally break the silence. But until then, all we have are stories, memories, and that aching feeling that justice was never served. I remember one year, during the anniversary of her death, someone left a little stuffed animal on the steps of her school, a faded teddy bear with a note that just read, "You're not forgotten." It sounds simple, but seeing that broke something in me. Even after all these years, people still feel the weight of what happened, still carry her memory in their own ways. It's like she became this quiet symbol for all the kids who've been forgotten, for all the cases that never got their fair ending. It's strange, feeling so much for someone you never really knew, but Araceli's story has a way of getting under your skin, of making you feel responsible somehow, like you owe it to her to keep her memory alive. And yet, as much as people remember her, as much as they gather and mourn, there's this sense of helplessness that hangs over it all. We light candles, say prayers, share stories, but in the end, we're still left with the same unanswered questions, the same doubts. Who really took her life? Why did they feel like they could get away with it? And how many others have suffered the same fate because the system lets certain people slip through the cracks? It's that lingering feeling that eats away at you, the realization that, in some ways, nothing has really changed. Over the years, I've met people who never heard of Araceli, people who moved to the city long after it all happened. When I tell them her story, they're shocked. like they can't believe something so horrific could have happened here, in what seems like a peaceful place. But that's the thing about darkness. It hides in plain sight, buried under years of silence and routine. I tell them because I want them to know, to remember, to keep that part of our history alive. I don't want her story to fade into a forgotten headline. She was more than that. She was a little girl with dreams, with friends, with a family that loved her, and her life was snatched away without a second thought. I think the least we can do is remember her. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if there's ever going to be a day when we'll finally get answered. Maybe it's wishful thinking, but a part of me still hopes that someone, someday, will step forward, that someone will break this wall of silence and bring some semblance of peace to Araceli's memory. Until then, though, it's just us, the ones who remember, the ones who still feel the weight of her story. And as long as we carry that, as long as we keep her name alive, there's a part of her that lives on, a part that the people who tried to erase her can never fully silence. In the end, Araceli's story isn't just about one girl or one family, it's about all of us. It's about what happens when the system we trust fails, when those with power can simply walk away, leaving devastation in their wake. It's a reminder that our world isn't as safe or as fair as we'd like to believe. And maybe that's why her story sticks with us, why it continues to haunt each anniversary, each memory, each candle lit in her name. She represents the innocence lost, not just for her family, but for everyone who trusted that justice would be served. Every year, as we gather to honor her, it feels like we're also mourning that part of ourselves that believed in a system that should have protected her. So here we are, all these years later, still talking about her, still searching for a peace that never came. Maybe it's futile, maybe we'll never get the answers we crave, but I think there's a kind of strength in refusing to let her memory be forgotten. In a way, it's the only justice we can give her now. As for me, I'll keep telling her story to anyone who will listen, because I believe that's what keeps her alive. And maybe one day, someone will hear it, someone who knows something, and the silence will finally break. Until then, all we have is her memory, and the promise that we won't let her fade away. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the unknown. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like and subscribe to Criminal Minds True Stories for more real-life mysteries. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant.